The date was June 14th, 1934, and the air over 125th Street was thick with the kind of humid, suffocating heat that makes even the strongest men irritable. In the heart of Harlem, the city never truly slept, but it hummed with a different frequency at 2 a.m. A rhythmic, syncopated heartbeat of jazz from the basement clubs and the distant, lonely sirens of the NYPD. High above the street, in a corner suite of the Hotel Teresa, Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson sat in a leather armchair that looked more like a throne than a piece of furniture. A single lamp cast a sharp amber glow across a mahogany chessboard. To his left, a volume of Langston Hughes' poetry lay open, the ink still fresh in his mind. To his right, a glass of neat scotch sat untouched, sweating in the heat. Bumpy was not looking at the board as a game. He was looking at it as a map. He wasn't just a man with a reputation for violence. He was a man who understood that power in Harlem was not measured in bullets, but in the psychological weight of one's shadow. The crisis had begun 3 days prior. It wasn't the usual friction with the Italian mobs from East Harlem or the petty squabbles of street-level numbers runners. This was something far more insidious. A group calling themselves the White Knights of Industrial Progress, a thin, cowardly veil for the Ku Klux Klan, had begun creeping across the invisible border of the 110th Street line. They weren't wearing robes yet. They wore the suits of real estate speculators and the badges of private security. They had sent tax notices to the black-owned pharmacies, the barber shops, and the grocery stores that served as the lifeblood of the community. The message was clear. Pay a sovereignty fee to the Knights, or watch your livelihood go up in a cloud of kerosene and matches. For Bumpy, this was more than an extortion racket. It was a declaration of war against the very soul of the Black Mecca. It was a challenge to the man who had sworn that, while the law might ignore Harlem, his justice would never sleep. Bumpy reached out a hand, his long, slender fingers hovering over a black knight. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness, a granite carving of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and decided he was the only one capable of governing it. His eyes, dark and analytical, didn't reflect the light. They seemed to absorb it. Across from him sat his most trusted lieutenant, a man everyone called the Professor for his ability to dispose of problems with clinical precision. The Professor watched Bumpy's hand. He knew that when Bumpy played chess, he wasn't just thinking about the next move. He was thinking about the ripple effect that move would have on the next generation of Harlem children. Bumpy finally moved the knight, a sharp, decisive click against the wood. It was a sacrificial move, one that looked like an error to a novice but signaled the inevitable collapse of the opponent's defense. He stood up slowly, the silk of his midnight blue suit catching the light. He didn't call for a crew. He didn't order a fleet of black Cadillacs to roar down the avenues. That was the way of the Italians, the way of men who needed the noise of an army to feel powerful. Bumpy Johnson knew that true fear is born in the silence of the unexpected. He checked his reflection in the mirror, adjusting his tie with the meticulous care of a surgeon preparing for a life-saving operation. Underneath the tailored jacket, tucked into a specialized holster at the small of his back, was a custom-made switchblade and a snub-nosed .38, though he doubted he would need the lead. He wanted them to feel the steel. He wanted them to feel the proximity of a man who was no longer human, but a personification of Harlem's collective rage. The Knights were congregating in the basement of a condemned warehouse on the far eastern edge of 125th Street. A place where the soot of the industrial yards met the salt of the East River. Inside, 15 men sat around a makeshift table, cluttered with maps, whiskey bottles, and several white hoods that lay like deflated ghosts upon the crates. They were led by a man named Silas Thorne, a disgraced former police officer with a penchant for arson and a deep-seated hatred for the rising tide of black prosperity. Thorne was shouting, his face flushed with fermented courage, explaining how they would burn the first shop on Lenox Avenue by dawn to remind the locals of their place. He was so loud, so intoxicated by his own perceived superiority, that he didn't hear the heavy iron door at the top of the stairs creak open. He didn't hear the soft, rhythmic footfalls of a man who moved with the grace of a panther in the tall grass. The basement was a cavern of shadows, lit only by a few hanging bulbs that flickered with the passing of the elevated trains nearby. Suddenly, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. One by one, the men stopped talking. They looked toward the staircase. Standing there, framed by the darkness behind him, was Bumpy Johnson. He didn't have a gun drawn. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his posture relaxed, his expression almost bored. He looked like a man who had accidentally wandered into the wrong party, yet the sheer aura of his presence forced the 15 men to scramble for their weapons. "Sit down," Bumpy said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant baritone that carried the weight of a funeral bell. "The first man to touch a holster will find out how long it takes to bleed out in a basement that doesn't exist on any map." Silas Thorne sneered, though his hand trembled as he reached for a Luger on the table. "You're a long way from home, boy. You think you can walk in here alone and talk to us like that? We represent the order of this country." Bumpy took a single step forward, his shadow elongating across the floor until it touched Thorne's boots. "The order of this country stops at the Harlem River. Beyond that bridge, there is only one order. Mine. You've been sending letters, Silas. You've been threatening people who work 18 hours a day to build something you could never understand. You think those white sheets make you ghosts? I've killed ghosts before. I've buried them under the pavement of the streets you're so afraid to walk on during the day." Thorne lunged for his gun, but Bumpy was faster than the eye could track. In a blur of motion that defied his calm exterior, Bumpy was across the room. He didn't pull his gun. He grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the table and shattered it across Thorne's jaw with a sickening crack. Before the other men could react, Bumpy had Thorne by the throat, the silver glint of his switchblade appearing as if by magic, the tip pressed just beneath the man's ear. The room froze. The 14 other men, despite being armed and outnumbering him, were paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated violence of the act. They were looking into the eyes of a Kisu, a grandmaster who had calculated their cowardice before he even entered the building. "You are 15 men," Bumpy whispered into Thorne's ear, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I am one. But I am the king of the ground you stand on. If any of you move, Silas dies. If you stay, Silas dies. The only question is, how many of you I take with me before the sun comes up." He began to move, a symphony of controlled destruction. He used Thorne as a human shield, navigating the room with a tactical brilliance that left the Klansmen tripping over their own feet. He didn't kill them all, not yet. He wanted them to feel the physical manifestation of their insignificance. He broke arms, shattered kneecaps, and used the environment, the heavy crates, the iron pipes, the whiskey bottles, as extensions of his own will. It wasn't a brawl. It was an execution of spirit. The air was filled with the sounds of snapping bone and the frantic, animalistic whimpers of men who realized that their ideology was no match for the cold reality of a man who had nothing to lose but his honor. After 10 minutes of calculated carnage, only 3 men remained standing, or rather cowering, in the corner. They were the youngest, the most impressionable, their faces pale with a terror that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Silas Thorne lay at Bumpy's feet, his face a ruin of blood and broken teeth, gasping for air. Bumpy didn't look tired. His suit was still perfectly pressed, save for a few dark droplets on his cuff that he wiped away with a silk handkerchief. He looked down at Thorne, then at the 3 survivors. "Look at your leader," Bumpy commanded. The survivors didn't dare look away. "He told you that you were superior. He told you that Harlem was a prize to be taken. But look at him now. He's just meat and bone, waiting for me to decide if he breathes another minute. I want you to remember this smell. The smell of damp concrete and your own fear." He leaned down, grabbing one of the white hoods from the table. He tossed it onto Thorne's chest. "Go back to your masters. Tell them that in Harlem, the sun doesn't rise for you. Tell them the moon is black and the shadows have teeth. If I see a single one of these bedsheets in my neighborhood again, if I hear so much as a whisper of a threat against a black businessman, I won't come for you in a basement. I will come for you in your homes. I will find you in your beds. I will use these very hoods as shrouds to bury every last one of you. Do you understand?" The survivors nodded frantically, their teeth chattering. Bumpy stood tall, his silhouette against the basement wall looking like a monolithic guardian of the night. "Pick up your trash and get out. Leave Silas. He and I have a few more things to discuss regarding the taxes he tried to collect." As the 3 men scrambled out of the warehouse, disappearing into the night like rats fleeing a sinking ship, Bumpy turned his attention back to the ruined leader. He didn't feel anger. Anger was for the weak. He felt a profound sense of duty. He was the wall between his people and a world that wanted to see them burn. He was the mayor because he did the things the real mayor was too scared or too prejudiced to do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black chess piece, a knight, and placed it firmly in Silas Thorne's open palm, closing the man's bloody fingers over it. "Checkmate," Bumpy whispered. By 5 a.m., the first hints of a bruised purple dawn began to creep over the Harlem skyline. Bumpy Johnson walked back toward the Hotel Teresa, his gait steady and rhythmic. The street cleaners were just beginning their rounds, the water from their hoses reflecting the neon lights of the Apollo Theater. He stopped at a small diner on the corner, where the owner, an elderly man named Pop, was just unlocking the door. Pop looked at Bumpy, seeing the dark spots on his cuff, seeing the weight of the night in his eyes. He didn't ask questions. Nobody in Harlem asked Bumpy questions they didn't want the answers to. "Morning, Bumpy," Pop said, tipping his cap. "Coffee's almost ready." "Make it black, Pop," Bumpy replied, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It's going to be a quiet day in Harlem." He sat at the counter, watching the neighborhood wake up. He saw the mothers heading to early shifts, the jazz musicians heading home with their instrument cases, the children starting to stir in the tenements. They didn't know about the basement on 125th Street. They didn't know about the blood on the concrete, or the message sent to the heart of the Klan. And that was exactly how Bumpy wanted it. A king doesn't brag about the heads he takes. He simply ensures that his people sleep soundly. This legend of the inviolable boundary has been whispered in the barbershops of Harlem for nearly a century. It is the story of a man who understood that in a world of wolves, you must be the wolf that the others fear. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal, yes, but he was a criminal with a code, a man who transformed the underworld into a shield for those who had no other protection. He proved that power isn't just about how much you can take, but how much you are willing to defend. What do you think? Was Bumpy Johnson a villain who happened to do good, or a hero who was forced into the shadows by a world that gave him no other choice? Does a community need a Bumpy Johnson when the law fails to protect its own? Share your thoughts on the legacy of the Godfather of Harlem Was he the king we deserved, or the one we needed?